Now, the other thing that the court said was, well, when you're looking at how to interpret something, you look at what was the interpretation made right after it was adopted. Well, as it turns out in this case, right after Prop M was approved by the voters, the city's attorney's office, at the request of the mayor, who of course did not support Prop M, who was very opposed to Prop M, asked the city attorney to write an analysis of what does Prop M mean. And the city attorney's analysis says, oh, well, it just means that you just have to balance all these things and decide that overall it's going to facilitate their achievement. If a policy is going to facilitate their achievement and not interfere with them, not impede their being implemented, then it's consistent with them. And so that's what the court said. Well, since that was done right after the policy, right after the proposition was approved by the voters, that should be the guiding light as to what does the policies mean and how do you get conform, how do you judge consistency. And so the court said, well, based on that, given that the Board of Supervisors gets a lot of discretion and a lot of deference as to how it decides this, and given that you don't have to be consistent with everything, you just have to be overall consistent, we're going to say it was all okay. And they went ahead and said, thumbs up, project's fine, even if it's going to tear down the entire park, half of the buildings in Parkmerced, even though it's going to certainly dramatically change the character of the Parkmerced neighborhood, it's still okay. So that's where things were left with the court decision. Essentially, I guess I would have to say it emasculated Prop M. It reduced it to being something that whatever the Board of Supervisors says it is, it is. The question is, what do we do about that? And I'm going to put forward basically 4 suggested ideas about how we might come up with a better Prop M. And they're going to be not easy ideas to implement because they aren't, I mean, it's easy to write something and say, well, let's write something and make it something everyone will be happy about in it. But this is not going to be that, because one of the first thing I would suggest that we need to do is we need to limit how many policies we put in there. Because the more policies you put in there, the more opportunities there are for someone to find that the policies conflict with each other. And when they can point to saying, oh, these policies conflict with each other, we can't possibly implement all of them. We're going to have to, even if it says we have to implement all of them, that's obviously impossible. And so that couldn't have been what was meant. So it needs to be focused on a few important, what we would consider really central policies, and saying these policies are what we're going to focus on. And these are the ones that we're not going to ask for everything under the sun. We're going to limit ourselves to a few important policies. Number 2, we've got to make those policies really clear. We've got to make those policies very concrete, very specific. So for example, just saying you should enhance the amount of employment, that's really vague. How do you tell if something's enhancing the employment? If you're going to put something, you basically need to say that it's got to have some sort of numerical values attached to it. Something where you can say, for example, if you're talking about traffic, there was a initiative that was put on the ballot. It ended up being thrown out by the California Supreme Court because they did it by a zoning change rather than general plan change. But there was an initiative put on the ballot in Walnut Creek that says no traffic intersection should be allowed to go below level of service D. If it's above level of service D now, it should not be allowed to fall below level of service D. Now that's a simple policy. That's very straightforward. You can do the analysis of saying what's the level of service now, what's it going to be after this project goes through. If the answer is it went from D to E, can't do the project. Something like that is very straightforward. There was another policy, which in fact is in one of the court decisions, where the general plan policy said you cannot put urban uses in a non-urban area. And they listed, they had a listing of all the urban uses. So if you have an area that's designated as non-urban, like agricultural or rural, you can't put any of those urban uses there. That's real straightforward. here are the uses, here's where they can't go. So that's one of the things that I think is important when you're writing these sort of policies, is to make those policies extremely specific and clear so that there's no question about, well, I'm not sure what that means. You have to make it crystal clear what it means. You have to make it crystal clear so that a judge who's looking at, well, was this consistent or not, can say, that was not consistent. Or that was consistent. He doesn't have to scratch his head, I'm not sure. Maybe we should just give the city council or the board supervisor the benefit of the doubt, because I can't tell. And if I can't tell, then maybe they couldn't tell. And again, the other standard that's applied to these types of decisions is essentially the test that's used is, it has to be, if you're going to say you can't, if you're going to say no, then you have to be that no reasonable person could say yes. That's the standard. So in other words, it has to be something that's so obvious that you've got to be an absolute insane person to think other than that. Again, if you can't go below level of service D, you have a project that brings it to level of service E, how can a reasonable person say that something that brought it to level of service E didn't bring it to level of service E? That's impossible. So that's how precise and that's how clear the policies have to be written, such that no reasonable person could conclude anything other than what you just concluded. The third, and this is again something that the Court of Appeal dinged us on, was they have to be mandatory. And if you read through these policies, that existing neighborhood serving retail uses be preserved and enhanced. Okay, well, yeah, that's sort of seems like it's saying this is what ought to happen. But what the court said, well, where's the shall? Mm-hmm. Where's the must? Mm-hmm. Where's the some wording that says you got to do this? Mm-hmm. And furthermore, there are 8 policies, and nowhere does it say that all 8 policies have to be followed. And in terms of the general rules, again, the general rule is as well, as long as overall it's consistent, that's good enough. So if you don't want that to be the rule, you've got to say, here are these 4 policies, and all 4 of these policies have to be followed to the letter. It has to be made that crystal clear that here are the policies, they're very clear policies, you got to follow every single one of them. And that's the 4th point. The 4th point is if you want to put in more than one policy, you have to make it clear, no, you don't get to choose 2 out of 3. If you want 4 policies to be enforced, you've got to say you've got to meet all 4 policies. If you don't meet all 4 policies, you're not consistent. So those are the 4 principles that I would put before you as saying, if we're going to write a new Prop M, those are 4 things we need to keep in mind in writing it. Because we don't want to have this happen again.